one of the really important things that we need to know that now that we're using manual all the time is the idea of an equivalent exposure. All right, so if I get an exposure that I like, right, the lightness, the darkness, the midtones, whatever, things aren't too blown out, my shadows aren't blocked up, right, a good exposure. Once I get that, take a picture, right, I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, good exposure, nice job, Brad. But right, I may realize that my shutter speed is too slow, or my shutter speed is too fast. For example, I do a lot of architectural photography. So if I have a shot set up of, a building, use this example in the last clip, somebody walks by, I don't want them to walk by and be so frozen, right, that whoever's looking at the building is like, oh yeah, this is the kind of building that snooty ass people that look like that walk by, right? Or I don't want to be like, oh, hey, I'm going to sue you because I showed up in your picture and I look funny, right? You're like, no, I just want a nice blurry figure that is not specific and we're good to go. So maybe I would want to slow my shutter speed down. How do I slow my shutter speed down without changing my exposure, right? Or I take a picture, right? I'm at an event, I'm doing a still life, anything at all, shooting a landscape. I take a picture, I look at the exposure, I'm like, okay, exposure's good, but not enough depth of field, right? I'm like, okay, I'm shooting an event, right? So I'm shooting groups of people. And I'm like, okay, well, my exposure looks good, but if I'm shooting 4 people, right, like the one I'm focusing on is sharp, and by the time I get to the people over here and over here, they're too far forward, they're a little bit soft. That doesn't work at all. Or I'm shooting a wedding, right? I'm shooting a table, right? There's like people in the back look good, the people in the front are not. I need to keep my exposure and increase my depth of field. How do I do that? I'm so glad you asked. It's actually not that bad. What we want to do, right, is we want to change the variable that we want to change, right? If I want my depth of field, I want to get more depth of field, right? I'm going to take my aperture and close it down. And, right, as I close that down, that's going to let in less light, so I need to make something else brighter, right? I make one variable darker or brighter, I make the other variables the opposite. In the end, it all ends up with the same exposure. Let's take a look at it. So I have my trusty camera. I know, lens cap's on. All right, I haven't taken a picture yet. Watch it. I am going to take a picture of a lovely still life that I have set up off screen over here. I'm on a tripod in my mind, maybe in your mind. Now it's in your mind. I'm on a tripod, so shutter speed and camera shake isn't going to be a big deal. But let's take a look and see what it looks like. I walk into the room and my ISO is at 100, right? Always good to start with your ISO low. There's nothing helpful about having a high ISO. More noise is never a good thing. So I'm gonna go over here and take a picture. All right, I am setting my exposure. I'm at 15th of a second and f2, and that looks pretty good. So, right, exposure looks good, lighting looks good. It all looks pretty nice, except when I zoom in there, the depth of field is pretty soft, right? I've focused on that box of slides kind of in the middle under the fan, but the stuff in front is totally soft and it looks kind of sloppy. So I'm going to go ahead, and what I want to do is to increase my depth of field, right? My camera position isn't moving. Increase my depth of field. The only option really at my disposal is to make my aperture a smaller hole. Smaller hole is a bigger number. So I'm going to go from f2 to f5.6. So I'm going to go from f2.0 to something that is a more closed down thing, right? So 2.0, I'm going to go to 5.6, and as I do that, I'm going to count the clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so that was 9 clicks. Each click is a third of a stop. We talked a little bit about this last week. You can tell if it's a third of a stop if you go from a known quantity to a known quantity. Remember, we memorized the full stop values of our aperture. So if you go to your camera, you set it to f8, you change your aperture to f11, right? If it's 3 clicks, that means each click is 1/3 of a stop. That's good to know, right? In case you're working for somebody and they say, open it up a stop. It's good to know because sometimes it's going to be important. Just assume it's good to know because I'm telling you and I'm right. But here, as long as we count the number of clicks, we'll be okay. So we did 9 clicks, right? That's 3 stops. But 9 clicks on our thing to get from f2.0 to f5.6. So 9 clicks to go from f2.0 to 5.6, that was making everything a smaller aperture. That means it is making it darker. I want to keep my exposure the same, so I want to make everything, if I'm making it darker with one variable, I want to make it lighter with one of the others. Right now, I'm going to do that with ISO, right? So I go to my ISO, I was at ISO 100, and I'm going to go, we had 9 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now I'm at ISO 800. Those of you who are thinking about stops, blurry, you will note that, again, 3 stops. So I went from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800. Those were the full stops, right? Boop, boop, boop. And now we're at 5.6 and ISO 800, and I should have an identical exposure. Come over here, magic, take a picture. Exposure is the same, right? Brightness and darkness of everything looks identical. So I've closed my aperture down, but my exposure stayed the same because for every click of me making that a smaller opening, every click of me not letting in as much light because it's a smaller hole, I did a click the other direction, increasing the sensitivity of the light, increasing the ISO, right? So 9 clicks one way, 9 clicks lighter. Stupid fucking noise. And I end up with the same exposure, but a different, smaller aperture and a higher ISO value. Now, if I look at this image, it's okay, but it's still a little bit soft on the depth of field. So I'm going to go ahead and change it up a little bit more, right? So there we had 15th of a second, 5.6. I'm going to go up to f8. Whoops. 1, 2, 3, right? So 3 clicks, that's a full stop. And that means if I'm going to get a full stop there, I need to get a full stop of, this is a full stop of making that hole smaller. So again, that's still making it darker. I'm going to keep my ISO going up again. 1, 2, 3 clicks. Another full stop going from 800 to 1600. So now I'm at f8, ISO 1600, and take a picture. I have the same exposure. Oops. So now I've got a picture where the depth of field is good, but maybe I want to try and stop that fan a little bit. How would I do that, right? I want to stop the fan by using my shutter speed. Right now my shutter speed is at a 15th of a second. That's pretty slow. It's very long exposure. I'm going to have a pretty blurry, obviously, fan. So I'm going to try and make my shutter speed faster. Okay, cool. I'm going to go down here, and instead of adjusting my ISO anymore, I'm going to go over here. Sorry. And I am going to take my shutter speed and start moving it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so that's a 60th of a second. It was 6 clicks. Every click is a third of a stop. 6 clicks is how many stops? 2. So I have gotten 2 stops faster on my shutter speed. So that means I need to, again, right, I'm letting in less light and less light and less light because it's not open for as long. So I'm going to need to do something else to make my exposure brighter so that it will stay the same. So that was 6 clicks to a 60th of a second. I'm going to go my ISO again, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Boom, 6400, right? Go back, take a picture. And now we can see that exposure is still the same, and that fan that before was just a continuous blur is a little bit frozen. There's actually a pink piece of tape on one of the blades of the fan, and so you can see it's sweeping a smaller arc during that exposure. Right, 60th of a second goes instead of going around and around and around. But still not enough. I would like to try and freeze it a little bit more, so I'd like to go up to a 250th. So 250th, here we go. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? 6 stops, or 6 clicks, that's 2 more stops. Okay, so I need to go 6 clicks again. All right, I have run into the limits of my ISO, right? Again, specific to my camera. My camera, boop, topped out 6400. You may be able to go higher, right? Or maybe I don't want to go higher than 6400 because I've used my camera and I know image quality is going to be terrible. So if I can't go up anymore in my ISO, right, because I'm here at 6400, if I can't go up my ISO, right, and I want to get the same exposure, that means what? What am I going to do? I'm going to have to make that aperture bigger again. All right, so here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now I have opened up my aperture again. It's going to give me a little bit less depth of field, but I should have the same exposure. And there you go. So now you can see, right, again, we are faster shutter speed, right? Fan spins less far during that exposure. But to get that, right, we've topped out our ISO, so we're going to have some noise in there if we look closely. And also I've lost some depth of field because I've had to open up my aperture to let in more light to keep the exposure the same. I'm going to do one more just sort of to see what it looks like. I'm going to bump it up to a 1,000th of a second because, hey, why not? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Boom. That means my aperture is going to have to open up even more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, 1,000th of a second at f2. And looks pretty good. So again, we are back at a place where we have pretty shallow depth of field, but we're freezing motion. This is how it works, right? Like, we figure out what our exposure is, we evaluate the picture, we see if there's something that we want to change about it, right? Not like compositionally, not like where the camera's pointed, not like what's coming into the frame, not like where the edges of the picture are, but do we want to change the aperture, right? Do we want to change the depth of field? Do we want to change the amount of motion blur? Do we want to change the shutter speed? And if the exposure is right, then as we change those things, we have to make sure that we adjust the other variables to keep the exposure consistent. So that's what you're going to be doing in our exercise. You're going to be going out, you're going to be doing two different things. You're going to be doing an ISO part of it, where you shoot locked down on a tripod, the same image at a range of ISOs. And you're also going to be doing some photographing where you get a picture, the same exposure, with two different values for either aperture or ISO or shutter speed. This maybe seems like weird esoteric thing. I can't emphasize enough how important this is, how much it plays into your daily photographing lives. Every time you go out and make a picture, you're going to get a good exposure. You're going to notice something that needs to be changed a little bit as far as depth of field or the amount of motion blur. You'll be taking a picture, it'll look great. You'll realize you're at a 60th of a second and you can't hand hold it. You're going to need to adjust one of the other variables to be able to keep that exposure and correct whatever motion, depth of field thing you have going on. So really worth practicing this, really worth getting a handle on it, becoming comfortable with it, right? The click thing, you know, some old photographer is going to come up to you and be like, bah! Maybe it'll be me. But the clicks, I mean, it works, right? It just makes sense. The important thing is to remember which way you're going. If you get confused, right? If you're like, oh no, I've gone like clicks this way and clicks that way, and I don't even know what the hell I'm doing. It's not a disaster. Don't worry about it. Just go back to your last exposure and see what your settings were, reset your settings to those, and then make the adjustment again. How do you do that? It is pretty straightforward. Here on my camera, if I take a picture, this is going to be a terrible picture. There we go, terrible picture, lovely. So when I hit my playback, I can go here on the Canon to info, cycle through that, and I will hit a point where it tells me my shutter speed, my aperture, and also my ISO for the last, I mean for any of my shots, but in this case for that last shot that I took. So if you get confused and you're not sure what it was that your last shot was at, that you've sort of like, you know, clicked away from it or whatever, go to the back of your camera, look at it, figure out that information, right? Set your controls back and start that clicking again. The most common mistake is you go the wrong direction, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to make my aperture a bigger opening, and then you also increase your ISO instead of decreasing your ISO, or you increase your shutter speed instead of decreasing your shutter speed. So when that happens to you, don't worry about it. It happens to everybody. Just go back to the last exposure that was good, use those settings again, and then again count the clicks going in the right direction this time. So go forth and do that, and I will look forward to seeing what you do after the break.